when you have totally different concepts of what is right and wrong, what is acceptable and not acceptable, it removes any capacity to have agreement to solve any problem whatsoever. That's why postmodernism and deconstructionism is the worst ideology that I can imagine. I mean, maybe second to communism, but it is absolutely evil at its core because it destroys any human relationship. It destroys love. It destroys marriage. Welcome, everybody, to the Salty Pastor Podcast. Today, the Daniel Penny case in New York and what it says about our current system of justice. What in the world has happened to justice? Why can't we as a society agree on what is just and what is not? What is right and what is wrong? What happens to a society or even your own life when justice is no longer just? Well, this is the Salty Pastor Podcast, and I, Dr. Douglas Peak, am your Salty Pastor. We are here to help coach you up in thinking for yourself. This is the best way to grow your faith, knowing what you believe and why you believe it, because that's one of the most important things about you. Your beliefs, your core values are the things that, first and foremost, drive your interpretation of the world events that are happening around you. Everything from massive political shifts all the way down to, is the guy in the line next to me in a good mood or a bad mood? It's what you believe deep down that helps you interpret everything going on in your life, accurately or inaccurately. It's what you believe that makes a huge difference in your own sense of meaning and purpose. Is what you are doing bringing meaning and purpose into your life? Well, that has to do with what you believe. It goes on and on and on, the ramifications. That's why I say what you believe is one of the most important things about you. And so I'm here to help you think for yourself clearly in order to determine what you believe. And once you know that what you believe is built on an objective, absolute, unchanging truth, that's when life starts to come into focus. And when we start living on the basis of our conviction and belief in an absolute reality, an absolute truth that's eternal and never changing, then 90% of your problems just go away. And so that's why we are here on the Salty Pastor Podcast to help coach you in how to discover this for yourself. One of the best things you can do is be a regular listener. So you can go over to our website. It's thesaltypastor.com. You can listen there. You can go to YouTube and you can actually watch and listen, or just listen, The Salty Pastor. And if you go to YouTube, do me a favor, like and subscribe. You can also click on the bell, and it will notify you anytime a new episode drops. You can also listen to us on, I believe, Spotify. You can listen to us on the podcast through Google. And just an update real quick. We had a little technical glitch with Apple. We don't know why, but on Thanksgiving, our podcast quit uploading to Apple Podcasts. So we are right now getting it fixed so that you can have access to all of those episodes and be brought up to speed. So that's one way that you can continue to grow in your faith by becoming a regular Salty Pastor Podcast listener. Now, we're currently in a series called Ideologies That Matter, and I have a subtitle for this. It's basically titled kind of a sub-theme, and that is that people aren't the problem, ideologies are the problem. And just kind of a side note I want to bring on is that one of the issues that we have in today's world is that we focus so much on people, and then we make judgments about people. Well, that person's a good person. That person's a bad person. And so what we do is we kind of put them in one of two camps, good or bad, friend or foe, partner or enemy. And I think one of the most difficult things about that is that's not only overly simplistic, but what we don't realize is that if you believe in the words of Jesus and what he said is that first and foremost, we have to deal with the own malevolence, the own evil in our own heart. And no one is ever 100% evil and no one is ever 100% good. It just doesn't work that way. We are all contradictory creatures. That's human nature. And Christ came in order to set us free from that contrary nature. And so one of the most important things to do is say, if people aren't the problem, then what is? What drives the evil and the injustice? And what drives insensitivity and non-caring, a lack of compassion or love, the inability for people to get along? What drives division and war? Well, you know what does? Ideologies. Now, on occasion, some person will adopt an ideology so purely without any self-doubt that you have to deal with that person. For instance, a criminal or somebody like, Lenin or Stalin or Mao Zedong or Pol Pot, these people that adopted ideologies that were just horrible. They had to be eliminated as human beings. That was the just thing to do. So, but overall, in a general sense, it's better to focus on an ideology and its influence in a person's life than simply saying, well, that person's bad. And so when you do that, you remove any opportunity for redemption or change or transformation. That's why I like to say ideologies are the problem. People aren't the problem. It's also a better way to argue, and it's a better way to, focus on truth and spread the truthful word, bring light into darkness. And that is, I'm not here attacking people. I'm here to attack ideologies. I'm not here to denigrate people. I'm here to denigrate the beliefs and ideologies that people adopt. And I do that by showing specifically how they have a negative impact on your life. Now, when we started off with the most prevalent ideology right now that most people are not aware of, and it's called postmodernism. And then its offspring, deconstructionism. And you can go back, listen. If you're an Apple Podcast listener, you'll be able to listen to those here fairly soon. I hope that it will be fixed either on the 10th or 11th of December. If you would like to get up to speed, you can always go to YouTube, listen there. But what is interesting is postmodernism and its offspring, deconstructionism, are the driving frameworks in which people are thinking today in American society. And the most important impact that these things have had upon our society is the destruction of justice. And this is very important to understand, not only on a high level, like, well, what kind of society do you want to live in America, but even on a personal level. And that is, do I really believe in justice? And does justice actually drive the way I think? Now, it's important to understand, I'm not trying to say, are you a just person or not? All right. What I'm trying to ask you to consider is, does justice drive your judgment? Does justice drive the things you hear and believe? Because if justice isn't an underlying core value, then oftentimes you will be manipulated by information. And you can be manipulated by half-truths, false truths, trends. You can be manipulated by a mob. Well, if everybody believes it, then you can believe it too. How do you counteract being driven, as Paul says in Ephesians chapter 4, here and there by every wind of teaching or every idea or empty philosophies of men? Well, the way you do that is you say justice is a core value. And it will not only drive my beliefs, my belief is this core value, but it also drives the way I think. It drives the way I think about myself, and it drives the way I think about situations. It drives what I think about other people. It drives what I think about events and data and information out there. When you have a justice orientation, the first and foremost thing it does is it becomes a rock solid compass that never fails to navigate everything going on in the world. And this, at its core, is a biblical concept. It is absolutely 100% biblical concept. There are so many passages in the Bible, Old Testament and the New Testament, that talk about justice, right? One of the most famous is Micah 6:8, where Micah says, "What does the Lord require of you but to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God?" But the Psalms are filled with the pursuit of justice. Justice for the poor, justice for the righteous, justice, God's desire for justice. The entire Old Testament is filled with that. But what I want to do is, instead of trying to bring all this out in one setting, I think the issue would be focusing on Jesus. And if you look at Isaiah, the book of Isaiah, which were prophecies about Jesus coming, you're going to find some really interesting things. For instance, in Isaiah chapter 42, we see a prophecy about Jesus as why he came. It says, "Behold my servant whom I uphold, my chosen in whom my soul delights. I have put my spirit upon him, and he will bring forth justice to the nations. He will not cry aloud or lift up his voice or make it heard in the street. A bruised reed he will not break, and a faintly burning wick he will not quench. He will faithfully bring forth justice." So what we see right here is that the coming Messiah, Jesus, was to bring justice. Jeremiah makes a prophecy about the Messiah as well in chapter 23, verse 5, where he says the following: "Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will raise up for David a righteous branch, and he shall reign as king and deal wisely, and shall execute justice and righteousness in the land." And you see, most particularly, Matthew's gospel. If you remember, the gospel according to Matthew was written to convince Jews that Jesus was the Messiah. So there's a lot of Old Testament references and prophecies contained in the gospel according to Matthew, because that was the intent of his gospel. And this is what he says in chapter 12, verse 18. He says, "Behold, my servant whom I have chosen, my beloved, with whom my soul is well pleased. I will put my spirit upon him, and he will proclaim justice to the Gentiles." So notice how it really reflects the Isaiah 42, 1 and 2 passage, is he says, but Matthew then pulls in this additional reference to the Gentiles, that justice will be proclaimed to Gentiles as well as Jews. Now, Acts chapter 8, verse 32 and 33 says this: "Like a sheep he was led to the slaughter, and like a lamb before its shear is silent, so he opens not his mouth." So they're referring to the crucifixion of Jesus and how it happened. "In his humiliation, justice was denied him. Who can describe his generation? For his life taken away from the earth." So what they're saying is that Jesus Christ sacrificed his life even though it was unjust, which, boy, that's a powerful principle when we're talking about the atonement. But that's for another time. And then what I want to do is I want to show another passage of Scripture, Luke chapter 17, where he talks about justice, okay? And he says in, not Luke chapter 17, Luke chapter 18, okay? And in Luke chapter 18, it says the following, verse 1. "Now Jesus was telling them a parable to show that at all times they ought to pray and not lose heart." Okay, so Luke, who recorded this parable, says the reason why Jesus told this parable is to not give up, persevere when it comes to prayer. And yet, it's really interesting about the context of the parable. Verse 2 says, "So he said, there was a certain city, a judge who did not fear God. He did not respect man." So that's a way of saying this judge was a narcissist, right? Verse 3. And there was a widow in that city, and she kept coming to him saying, give me legal protection from my opponent. And for a while he was unwilling. But afterward he said to himself, even though I do not fear God nor respect man, yet because of this widow bothers me, I will give her legal protection, lest by continually coming she would wear me out. So what Jesus is saying in this parable is, look, don't give up, because people who don't even fear God, respect men, in other words, people who are driven completely selfishly, will comply for no other reason than they don't want to be pestered all the time. So verse 6, then Jesus kind of wraps this parable up. He says, hear what then the unrighteous judge said. Now shall not God bring about justice for his elect, who cry to him day and night? And will he delay long over them? I tell you that he will bring about justice for them speedily. However, when the Son of Man comes, he will find faith on the earth. So here's a bunch of really great, subplots going on here. I just want to point out the overall plot is that the Lord is not an unrighteous judge at all, but he has passion for his people, because he is basically pointing out that when the Son of Man comes, he's going to bring justice, and he's going to find faith that God will bring about justice. So there's spiritual implications and there's social implications here. We're not going to dig into all those. What I want to do is I want to talk about how all of these passages of Scripture make a very specific point. There is a thing called justice, and justice exists outside of human events, human endeavors, human history. There is an objective standard for what is just and what is not just. Therefore, that means there are some things that are always wrong no matter what. It doesn't matter what culture you live in. It doesn't matter what language you speak. It doesn't matter what point in human history that you lived. There are some things that have always been wrong and continue to be wrong today in all cultures, all across the board. So that means there is an objective standard that human souls, human hearts are able to comprehend, regardless of their historical placement, their language, their socioeconomic standard, whatever, across the board. There's some things that are always wrong and some things that are not. Now, remember, postmodernism, though, rejects this as being true. There is a rejection of absolute truth. Therefore, there's no objective standard of justice. It is all relative. It is all subjective. It's simply a socially constructed narrative. And the emphasis in postmodernism is on subjectivity, and therefore it creates moral relativism, or, as I like to say, moral chaos. And there's a skepticism towards any institution or any person or any group of people, organization, or philosophical consistency where there is a claim that there is an objective standard of justice, because they would say, well, that's a universal claim, and we're skeptical of all universal claims. We are skeptical of all meta-narratives. So what is the end result? We talked about this 2 weeks ago, but I just want to bring you up to speed, is that it creates a moral chaos. Moral relativism is a cancer that destroys any and all nations, states, institutions, organizations, whether secular or religious, businesses, sports teams, churches, you name it. Moral relativism, moral chaos, a lack of a standard for objective justice destroys it all. The primary reason for this is that moral relativism equals it's just chaos. There's nothing that bonds people together because there is no agreement. At a large level, on nations and states, all the way down to just two people sitting in a room trying to work together. If you have two or three people in a room and they have totally different concepts of what is right and wrong, you just don't have a difference of opinion. You have a seriously divisive outcome. And so that's what causes moral chaos. If you put three people in a room and you say, okay, you guys need to, figure out a way to solve a problem. And one person says, well, if we kill all of our opponents, then we'll solve our problem. And the next person says, no, we need to seek a way because I value life. We can't just kill people we don't like. And we have to have some type of compromise in which you can see when you have totally different concepts of what is right and wrong, what is acceptable and not acceptable, it removes any capacity to have agreement to solve any problem whatsoever. That's why postmodernism and deconstructionism is the worst ideology that I can imagine. I mean, maybe second to communism, but it is absolutely evil at its core because it destroys any human relationship. It destroys love. It destroys marriage. It destroys partnerships. It destroys businesses. The list just goes on and on and on and on of everything that it destroys. Okay? So the best place that we've seen this manifest itself is in the situation around Daniel Penny. I'd like to jump into that real quick. First, if you're unfamiliar with the case, here are the basic facts as we know them. Daniel Penny, he's 26 now. I think he was 24 and a half, maybe 25. He is a Marine veteran. So he served, honorably discharged as a Marine. He was riding the subway in New York City. A homeless man who was also a drug addict by the name of Jordan Neely. He was also black. He was high. He had a very large knife, and he got on the subway and he started to threatening everybody in the subway car. He stated, "I am going to kill you." He was acting high, very erratic, and very crazy. What happened is that Daniel Penny and another man who was black subdued Jordan Neely. They basically took him down, took the weapon out of his hand, and then Daniel Penny put him in a chokehold. The chokehold that he used is the one that the Marines had trained him to employ in order to detain a person. When the cops arrived at the next stop, or the next one, it happened fairly quickly, Jordan Neely was still breathing and he was still alive. The cops then took him into custody. They took him to the hospital. And when he was at the hospital, they pronounced him dead. So he died while he was in the possession of the police or in transit with the paramedics and the ambulance crew or at the hospital. So that's the basic case. Now, New York County, as well as New York City District Attorney Alvin Bragg, chose to charge Daniel Penny with second-degree manslaughter and criminally negligent homicide. These are serious, serious charges. What happened is when the jury could not come to consensus on the first charge, in a move that is the basis for an appeal in any case, the judge, this is kind of crazy, dismissed the first charge, which is second-degree manslaughter, in order to allow the jury to convict on the second charge. However, the jury found him not guilty of any of the charges brought against him by the district attorney. And this just happened, I believe, on Monday, the 9th of December. Now, it's also important to note that there was an extremely similar case a few years prior when Alvin Bragg was the district attorney, where all the facts in this earlier case were almost identical to the Daniel Penny case. There was only one difference, and that is the person who subdued the homeless drug addict was a man who was black. That man was never charged with anything, and he was considered a hero. Therefore, the only difference in these two cases was the color of the skin of the hero. So everybody's going to debate the case. You can listen to all kinds of podcasts and dig into why, the legalese or this, that, and the other. What I want to talk about, how is it possible that we have two distinct measures of justice in the world today solely based on skin color? And here's where you see postmodernism having its negative effect on society. Now, let's get to the rubber meeting the road, because a postmodernist would state that all justice is subjective, right? There's no objective truth that brings about an objective standard or an objective outcome that could be considered just at all times. They would state that history shows this. For instance, they would say, well, during the 50s and 60s, black people in the South lived under Jim Crow laws. They were persecuted, abused, had visited upon them every indignity that you can imagine. And this, of course, is true. This is historically an accurate fact, right? And this proves that justice is subjective and relative. Therefore, today the tables have simply turned, and now the winds of justice are blowing in a different direction. Well, a person who doesn't think for themselves would say, yeah, that makes perfect sense. But a person that thinks for themselves would say, well, if there is an objective truth standard, they would say you cannot have different forms of justice and maintain any type of cohesiveness in the society. This is relativism, different types of justice based on your skin color. And it not only destroys nations, it destroys states, cities, free markets, families, anything else near you or involved with you on any daily basis. And the ramifications of a morally relativistic form of justice are incredibly broad, they are incredibly deep, they're incredibly divisive, and they are capricious or subjective by nature, and that, of course, makes them evil. So these people would argue this. This is their argument. They would say, well, it was because there was an objective moral standard that allowed people to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that treating black people in the South in the 50s and 60s under Jim Crow was wrong and evil. The implication is clear. Martin Luther King made this exact argument in his infamous letter from the Birmingham jail, where he argued that there was an objective standard of justice and truth. And in the South, the government was not living up to this objective standard. Therefore, Jim Crow laws were unjust and evil. It was because there was an objective standard of justice that required Martin Luther King to protest them. And how did he do it? Through nonviolence. In other words, what he did is he intentionally broke an unjust law and then willingly suffered the consequences. And it was in the suffering of the consequences that everyone saw there was an actual objective standard of justice, and the government in the South was not living up to that standard. So I would argue that it was an objective standard of justice that proved Jim Crow laws were evil. But postmodern form of justice would argue, well, Jim Crow laws were just because that was the societal narrative at the time. And now that the societal narrative changed, the difference is just today. That makes no sense to me. That just seems idiotic because people don't live that way or think that way or act that way. So let me wrap up our discussion today with this, and then we'll pick up a lot deeper on it for the Thursday's podcast, is that the only way that things can change for the better is if you have an objective standard by which to evaluate whether or not current laws are just or if they're evil. That's Martin Luther King's argument, and that is the best way to improve. Therefore, if you have a postmodern definition of justice, you stop any possibility to progress forward because there's no objective standard to determine whether you're doing a good job or not. Number two, if you attempt to use a postmodern ideological framework, what you end up with is injustice. And that's exactly what happened to the Daniel Penny case, is that Daniel Penny was unjustly charged, and he should have been considered a hero. As a matter of fact, because he was charged, and when you saw the arguments against him and people became aware of the case, everyone began to see how bereft of any moral clarity Alvin Bragg and his charges against Daniel Penny had any merit. That what they saw is that postmodern ideology has no moral clarity to it whatsoever. And towards the end of the situation, even the mayor of New York City, Eric Adams, came out and said that Daniel Penny should have never been charged and he should be considered a hero in the city of New York. What an interesting conclusion to that story. But it illustrates for us a very important principle, and that is postmodern ideology is very destructive. And it's mostly destructive to the concept of justice. I want you to understand what justice is, that it's a standard that exists objectively outside of yourself. And I hope that you would consider how justice is a core value that drives your way of thinking, and it drives your beliefs that flow out of this foundational core value or belief. And that right there will bring more peace, more meaning, more purpose to your life than you could ever imagine. Absolutely across the board. Well, I'm going to stop there, and we'll pick up on Thursday and talk about the implications of justice and how postmodernism is undermining it in just everyday life. I'd love for you to help become a supporter of the Salty Pastor Ministries. It is a standalone ministry, and we are doing some new things. So all you got to do is go to our website, click on that donate button. You can become a regular supporter of the Salty Pastor Ministries. Our goal is to get hundreds and thousands of people who are just willing to, $50 a month to support this. And we're going to be doing all kinds of new things out there. For all of you who are supporting this ministry, I want to say thank you. Your gifts are incredible. So feel free to become a part of the Salty Pastor, Salty crew at any time. Also, as we are in December now, I want to just say, I hope that you have a wonderful holiday season, and that, man, your Christmas is not only a celebration of the birth of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ, but it is also a celebration of every good and blessed things that he brings to this world. Until then, my friends, remember, always think for yourself.